The wind had teeth that morning, the kind of cold that came down off the ridge and cut through even a good coat, and Jacob Marsh stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his hat in his hands and his daughter asleep on his back. Her small arms looped loosely around his neck. Her cheek pressed against his shoulder blade the way she had slept since she was small enough to be carried in one arm. He had walked the better part of 2 days to reach the Callaway spread, following directions given to him by a stranger at a crossroads store, who said the widow there was known to hire drifters for the fall work, and he had walked them on an empty stomach because what little money he had left had gone to a loaf of bread and a tin of milk for the girl 3 days before. He was 31 years old and looked older, the way men who have buried a wife and raised a child alone through 2 winters tend to look older than the calendar says they ought to, and when the door of the ranch house opened and a woman stepped out onto the porch with her arms crossed and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, he straightened his back as best he could under the weight of his sleeping daughter and asked, plainly, without pride to spare for softening it, whether she had any work. The woman's name was Eleanor Callaway, and she had buried a husband 2 winters back to a fever that took him in 11 days flat, and had spent the time since running 400 acres of cattle and hayfield with a foreman who was competent but old and a handful of hired hands who came and went with the seasons like the birds did. She looked at Jacob for a long moment before she answered, the way a person looks at another person when they are trying to read a whole life story in the set of shoulders and the state of boots, and what she read in him, she would say much later, was not the desperation she had expected but something steadier beneath it, a man holding himself together for the sake of someone smaller than himself. She asked him his name, and he gave it, and she asked what work he could do, and he told her plainly that he could mend fence, break horses if she needed it, keep books if she had books that needed keeping, having clerked 2 years in a mercantile before the war took that town apart same as it had taken so many others, and that he was not a man who complained about hours or whether so long as the work was honest. She asked then, the question that made him go still, nodding toward the small sleeping shape on his back. Who is she? And he said, in a voice gone rough at the edges, that she was his daughter, Mercy, 4 years old, that her mother had died birthing her, and that he carried her because there was no one else in the whole wide, unforgiving world to carry her if he set her down. Eleanor Callaway did not answer right away. She looked past him at the empty road he had walked in on, and then at the child's small dirty hand curled loosely against her father's collar, and something crossed her face that Jacob would not understand the full shape of until much later, an old grief of her own surfacing briefly and going still again, the grief of a woman who had wanted children with her husband and had been given, instead, 2 winters of trying and then a fever and a grave and an empty house too large for one person's footsteps to fill. She told him she would hire him, for the fall work and to see how the winter went after that, and that there was a small cabin on the property, sound enough, that he and the girl could have to themselves rather than bunking with the hired hands, which surprised him, because bosses did not often extend that kind of courtesy to a man who arrived with nothing but a sleeping child and a request for work. And then she said the thing that truly stopped him where he stood, delivered as plainly as she had delivered everything else, without softness or apology, the way a woman says a true thing she has decided not to be ashamed of. She said that she did not need another hired hand so much as her heart, lately, had been aching for something she had no right to ask a stranger for, and that if it would not offend him, she wanted, more than the fence mended or the books kept, simply to know what it might feel like to have a daughter in the house again, even if only as someone else's, even if only borrowed, even if only for the length of a season. Jacob did not know how to answer that. He had come expecting, at best, a day's wage and a place to sleep, and instead he was being offered something that felt too large and too strange to trust immediately, a kindness so specific and so nakedly stated that his first instinct, born of 2 hard years of learning that the world rarely gave without eventually taking twice as much back, was suspicion. He asked her, carefully, what she meant by that, whether she intended some claim on the child, and Eleanor's face changed then, softened with something like understanding for his wariness, and she told him no, that Mercy would always and only be his, that she was not asking to take anything from him, only to be allowed near it, to set a small plate at her table sometimes, to plait a girl's hair once in a while if the girl would let her, to have, in whatever measure he was willing to permit, the small ordinary miracles of a child's presence in a house that had gone too quiet for its own good. She said it and then seemed almost embarrassed by the saying of it, and turned to go back inside, telling him gruffly that the cabin was down past the second barn and that supper was at 6 if he wanted to bring the girl to the main house table rather than cook alone in a cold cabin on his first night. He took the cabin. He took the work. And in the weeks that followed, he watched something unfold that he had not expected and could not entirely explain even to himself. Watched his daughter, who had been guarded and quiet since her mother's death in a way that broke his heart every single day, begin to warm to the widow the way a plant that has been kept too long in shadow will lean, slowly and almost shyly, toward whatever light finally reaches it. Eleanor did not push. She did not swoop in with gifts or forced affection the way some lonely adults do with children, transparent in their need and therefore easy for a child to distrust. She simply made room, set an extra chair, left a spare hair ribbon on the porch rail without comment, let Mercy watch her churn butter without asking the girl to help until the girl asked first, and over the slow turning of that autumn, Mercy began to seek her out, began to trail after her in the kitchen garden, began to fall asleep some evenings against Eleanor's side on the porch swing while the grown-ups talked past her head about hay yields and cattle prices, and Jacob watched all of it. With a feeling in his chest he did not have adequate words for, something between gratitude and grief and a fear he did not examine too closely, the fear of a man who has learned that good things can be taken from him without warning and who therefore holds even his hopes at arm's length. He worked hard that fall, harder perhaps than the job strictly required, in the way a man works when he is trying to earn something he cannot name, and Eleanor noticed, and told her foreman more than once that she had never seen a hired man tend fence lines so thoroughly, nor keep books so precisely, nor break a green horse so patiently, and the foreman, an old dry-humored man named Silas who had worked the Callaway spread since before her husband died, told her plainly one evening that a man does that kind of work for one of two reasons, either because he is running from something or because he is running toward it, and that in his considerable experience watching men come and go through that country, Jacob Marsh had the look of a man doing the second. Eleanor did not answer him, but she thought about it long after the conversation, out on the porch in the cold with her shawl pulled tight, watching the lamplight in the cabin window where Jacob was, she knew without being told, reading to his daughter from the one battered book he owned, the same 3 stories over and over because it was all he had and Mercy did not seem to mind the repetition, finding comfort instead in its predictability the way children who have known too much unpredictability often do. The winter that followed was hard, the way winters in that country always were, and it tested them all in ways that either break people apart or weld them together depending on what they were already made of. There was a stretch in January when the snow came so deep and so fast that the cattle had to be dug out of drifts twice in 1 week, and Jacob worked alongside Silas and the other hands until his hands bled inside his gloves, and Eleanor kept the fires going in both the main house and the cabin, refusing to let either Jacob or his daughter go cold even when it meant burning through wood faster than she had budgeted for the season. There was a night in February when Mercy took a fever that frightened them both badly, a fever that climbed and climbed despite every remedy Eleanor knew, and Jacob sat up 3 nights running with his daughter's small hand in his, praying in the wordless desperate way of a man who has already lost one person he loved to fever and cannot survive losing another, and Eleanor sat up with him, wringing cool cloths and murmuring old remedies her own mother had taught her, and somewhere in the depth of that 3rd sleepless night, when the fever finally broke and Mercy's breathing evened out into something like ordinary sleep, Jacob looked up and found Eleanor looking back at him with an exhaustion and a relief that mirrored his own so exactly that he understood, in that unguarded moment, that whatever this had become between the 3 of them, it was no longer merely an arrangement of employment and borrowed family. It had become, without either of them declaring it, something closer to what a family actually was. He told her so, eventually, in the thaw of early spring, standing at the corral fence with the first green coming up thin and hesitant in the yard, told her that he did not know what to call what had grown up between them over that hard winter, only that he did not want to leave when the season's work was done the way seasonal hands were expected to leave, that he had come looking for a wage and had found, instead, more than he had known to hope for, and that if she would have him, not as a hired man any longer but as a husband, he would spend the rest of his years trying to be worthy of the kindness she had shown a stranger and his daughter on a cold morning the autumn before. Eleanor did not answer him quickly, because she was not a woman given to quick answers on matters that mattered, but she did not look away from him either, and when she finally spoke, she said that she had buried one husband already and had told herself she would not risk that particular grief twice, but that watching him with his daughter all winter, watching the two of them lean into each other and, slowly, lean into her as well, had taught her that a person could go on refusing risk only so. Long before the refusing itself became its own kind of loss, and that she would rather risk grief again than spend the remainder of her life safe and empty in a house too large for the silence in it. They married that April, in a small ceremony on the porch where he had first asked her for work, with Silas standing witness and Mercy in a new green dress Eleanor had sewn for the occasion, standing between them holding one hand of each. And when the circuit preacher asked, near the end of the service, whether there was anything further either of them wished to say, Eleanor knelt down in front of Mercy, in front of the whole small gathered company of hired hands and neighbors, and asked the girl, formally, solemnly, as though it were a question of equal weight to the vows just exchanged, whether she would allow Eleanor to be called her mother, not to replace the one she had lost, whom Eleanor promised always to speak of with honor, but to stand alongside that memory as something additional rather than something erasing. And Mercy, 4 years old and still shy of strangers, but no longer shy of this particular woman who had waited so patiently and so gently for exactly this moment to be freely offered rather than claimed, said yes, and threw her arms around Eleanor's neck the way she had once thrown them only around her father's, and Jacob, standing above them both, felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight since his wife's death finally, fully, release. They built a life together on that spread over the years that followed, and the ranch prospered under the combined work of a man who had once had nothing and a woman who had once had everything except the one thing she wanted most, and Mercy grew up between them with 2 mothers' worth of love folded into the memory of one and the daily presence of the other, and grew up, too, with a brother and then a sister born to Jacob and Eleanor in the years after, so that the house that had once echoed with a widow's lonely footsteps came instead to ring with the ordinary chaos of children's voices. And Eleanor would say, in the quiet of certain evenings when she sat on that same porch with her husband beside her and her children's laughter drifting up from the yard, that she had asked a stranger once for the smallest and most impossible thing, only to have wanted a daughter for a season, and had been given, in return, by whatever grace governed such matters, an entire family, a whole unlooked for life, built out of one cold morning's honesty and the courage of 2 people willing to risk being known by each other rather than remain safely, separately, alone.